Frost clung to the barrels of the American MPs' rifles. Breath hung in the air on a December afternoon in the Ardennes. Through the mist, a jeep rolled up the road, coming from the front lines. 3 men in US uniforms greeted them, their faces drawn from cold and fatigue. The MPs asked for the password. The reply came smooth. Confident, maybe too smooth. Then the driver slipped, just for half a word. An accent surfaced and vanished. Suspicion hardened. The guards raised their guns and pulled the men from the jeep. The search began fast and rough. Under the seat, they found stacks of crisp $100 bills, British Stens, German pistols, grenades, and even a lighter hiding a glass vial of poison. When the smallest man finally cracked, his story chilled the checkpoint silent. He wasn't a GI. He was Wilhelm Schmidt, and he spoke of dozens more trained to pass as Americans moving unseen through the Allied rear. They were sent by Otto Skorzeny, the German Commando King. And as the interrogators pieced it together, one possibility froze them more than any other. These men had come to assassinate the one man whose loss could unravel the entire European front. December in the Ardennes had the color of frost and an air of fear. The German offensive that exploded into the snow on December 16, 1944, which would be named the Battle of the Bulge, ripped the Allied front to pieces across a broad arc. Units were cut off, telephone lines were severed, supply columns choked, and paratroopers and saboteurs were reported far behind the lines. Rumor fed rumor, and the front that had felt steady for months shuddered like one large, ugly animal. In that chaos, a highly unusual operation took shape in the German rear, a small program of infiltration and impersonation organized by SS commandos under the notorious Otto Skorzeny. English-speaking German volunteers were being gathered, tested for language and manner, and, where possible, given time among American prisoners of war to sharpen their accents. They were drilled until they could pass as GIs. The Germans called their efforts many things on the maps and in the briefing rooms. Allied intelligence would later call the whole enterprise Operation Greif. Its aim, as whispers and prisoner statements conveyed to US counterintelligence, was not merely to disrupt traffic, cut communication, confuse convoys, and blow bridges. It was to let wolves in American clothing move through the Allied rear. Skorzeny's name carried a dossier of audacious operations, liberating Mussolini, abductions, attempted assassinations, and the rumor of a single terrible objective. If anyone could have broken the Allied nerve more seriously than 100 broken roads or a scorched bridge, it was the sudden, violent removal of the commander who had become the campaign's central figure, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. To lose Eisenhower in the fog of war would not simply be a tactical catastrophe, it would be a political earthquake, one that might fracture the fragile coalition and prolong a war already burning at a brutal pitch. On the afternoon of December 18th, on the bridge at Iway in the Ardennes, a mixed guard of MPs and American service troops sat watch. They were 2 miles from the front, 2 days into the German offensive, and suspicion hung in the air. At noon, a jeep approached, slowing as it met the barrier. The sentry demanded the password. The man behind the wheel stuttered. He did not have it. What followed should have been routine, a challenge, proof, or continuation, but it cracked open into a dire revelation. The 3 men in the jeep called themselves Private First Class Charles W. Lawrence, Private First Class George Sensenbach, and Private First Class Clarence van der Werth. The names were ordinary, the men looked ordinary, and they spoke excellent English. But beneath the seat, hidden from casual eyes, was a roll of freshly printed $100 bills, the product of a Nazi forgery operation. When the jeeps were searched more thoroughly, the small arsenal inside read like the kit of professional saboteurs: British Sten machine pistols, Colts, German Walters grenades, plastic explosives, a radio transmitter, and cigarette lighters that concealed tiny vials, the lethal L-pills. These were a grim piece of spycraft, glass capsules of cyanide meant to be crushed between the teeth before capture. One bite ended everything in just a matter of seconds. What shattered any polite pretense was the confession. The smallest of the three, who had been passing as George Sensenbach, admitted his true name, Wilhelm Schmidt. He was a corporal in the German army, one of the volunteers who had gone to SS camps for refresher training in American ways. He told, plainly and chillingly, of the route they had taken from Monschau on December 12th, of how they had passed American lines posing as troops of the 5th US Armored Division, and how their mission had been to assess Meuse, bridges, and the roads that fed them. That alone was a grave threat. The Meuse crossings were arteries of movement and supply. But the interrogation went on. Schmidt told of specialized engineers in his group, whose task, he said, was the destroying of headquarters and headquarters personnel. As the interrogation went on, one name came up: Skorzeny. Then a scheme surfaced. A company here, a cell there, a group of English-speaking Germans mobilized at Osnabrück and Friedenthal for reconnaissance and sabotage. The Americans realized, with a cold clarity, that these were not random acts of chaos, but elements of a coordinated, long-range plan. As other Germans in disguise were captured, some of them allegedly claimed to be working on a mission to assassinate Eisenhower himself. Within hours, the capture at Aiway rolled into a new storm that raced to Liège, and then, in a blur of jeeps and CIC agents, toward headquarters. The story could have stopped with a handful of captured saboteurs, less sensational in a war full of such reports. However, the particulars, Skorzeny's known taste for high-profile coups and Schmidt's confession of orders to target headquarters personnel, swung the matter into personal danger for the Supreme Allied headquarters in Versailles, where Eisenhower's command was located. The Counterintelligence Corps in Europe, led in the theater by Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Sheen, moved from shadow to action. Sheen and his agents were not household names at Versailles. They were a scrappy, marginalized outfit in a web of intelligence organizations, some still precursors of post-war agencies, working for recognition and, frankly, survival. Sheen's men had been bruised by politics back in Washington. They had been scattered overseas after scandals and accusations. In Europe, they faced an almost impossible mission: to reveal the unseen and demonstrate the significance of the CIC. If Skorzeny's men were aiming for a high-value target, if headquarters really meant the Allied command, the CIC's success or failure would be measured in lives and in the ripples that followed a commander's death. Despite the urgency, security at Versailles did not harden overnight. The headquarters had, in ordinary times, been a bustling, international, and by its nature, a somewhat permeable organism. The hangman's dilemma, as Major Noel Annan later called it, was ever present. Who would pay the price if an error or oversight allowed catastrophe? The nervousness that Sheen installed spread through the staff. Paris adopted a strict curfew. Pigalle emptied of leave-taking doughboys. American soldiers in the guards held up even top commanders as they passed checkpoints. Brigadier General Bruce Clark was stopped and arrested by MPs who thought him an impersonator and kept him in custody for hours while St. Vith's fate hung in the balance. General Omar Bradley found himself halted 3 times and forced to prove his identity with answers that were equal parts trivia and insult. The capital of Illinois, a football analogy, the name associated with a pin-up star. Bernard L. Montgomery, British Field Marshal, even had to plead for American identity documents to move safely. The result was a surreal moment in which, as a historian would later put it, 500,000 GIs played cat and mouse with each other. When the tide of the bulge finally rolled back and the guns fell silent on that particular set of white hills, the question of intent remained knotted between evidence and motive. The captured men, like Schmidt, were tried as spies, with no Geneva Treaty protections, no POW considerations. Commandos and spies, especially those wearing enemy uniforms, faced capital punishment. The 4 captured near Aiway were taken to Henri Chapelle, bound and shot for their crimes. The immediate operational threat to any headquarters was blunted by arrests and by the practical difficulties German commandos faced in Paris and the Allied rear. Yet the deeper question was, had Skorzeny intended to assassinate Eisenhower? In May 1945, when Skorzeny himself surrendered to American custody, Colonel Sheen drove to southern Germany and interrogated the scar-faced Austrian at length. Skorzeny, skilled in bravado and ambiguity, refused a straightforward confession. Later on, in subsequent interviews, he claimed there was never a German plan to attack General Eisenhower's headquarters. But someone in Skorzeny's shoes would naturally say that, probably trying to lessen his punishment and get on the good side of his captors, especially since former enemies might team up against a new threat from the east. When a later private encounter brought Skorzeny to a hospital bed in Hamburg, the old commando was asked directly whether he had truly intended to assassinate Ike. His reply, half evasion, half swagger, was, "I shall not answer that directly, but you must believe this. If I had intended to, I would have done so." That enigmatic answer is the last recorded echo of the question. So, what really happened in December 1944? The truth might never be uncovered. However, in those freezing Ardennes hours, the Allies in the rear realized the front lines could bite back pretty hard, and that even a commander's HQ, which should have been safe, could become a target in a war that had already thrown out most of its rulebook.